In the shadows of the night, when Tokyo falls silent and even the bravest prefer to stay indoors, her name was whispered with fear. Kanae Kijima appeared to be an ordinary woman, but behind her smile lay a soul steeped in darkness. Those who fell into her web disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a trail of horror and blood. Kanae Kijima was born on November 27, 1974, in Tokyo, Japan. She grew up in a middle-class family that seemed to provide her with everything she needed for normal development. From an early age, Kanae exhibited unusual traits. She was very introverted, yet skilled at manipulating those around her. Her manipulations began with small things. She expertly induced guilt in her parents when she didn't get what she wanted. As she grew older, her manipulative skills only improved. At school, Kanae was an average student, but her behavior began to show the first signs of future cruelty. Her classmates described her as an unremarkable and modest girl, but those who tried to get closer to her noticed her ability to cleverly bypass any obstacles in her way. She wasn't shy about using others' weaknesses to her advantage, a tendency that began to emerge in her relationships with people during her teenage years. After finishing school, Kanae enrolled in college, where she studied social sciences. Here, she developed a deeper interest in psychology and social interactions, a key turning point in the formation of her future criminal tendencies. Kanae studied human behavior, their reactions to various situations, and most importantly, how to control those reactions. Her knowledge and skills in this area allowed her to construct complex manipulation schemes that she later used in her criminal activities. During the period after college, Kanae worked at various temporary jobs but never stayed long. She was dissatisfied with ordinary routine tasks and sought something more, something that would give her a sense of power over others. It was during this time that she first began to think about how she could use her skills for personal gain, not just manipulating for small benefits. In the early 2000s, the internet became accessible to the masses, and Kanae quickly realized that it was the perfect platform for her manipulations. She began actively using various online communities and dating sites, where she presented herself as a caring and understanding woman, looking for a serious relationship. In reality, Kanae already saw these platforms as an opportunity for her future criminal endeavors. She created dozens of fake profiles, from which she corresponded with numerous men simultaneously. Each time she built complex and carefully thought out relationships, gradually earning the trust of her interlocutors. Kanae had a unique ability to understand what each specific person needed and use this to draw them into her web. This period of Kanae Kijima's life can be seen as preparation for what was to come later. Her life was gradually becoming more dangerous and her manipulations more ruthless. However, at this point, she had not yet crossed the line into the heinous crimes that would later make her one of Japan's most notorious criminals. After several years of experimenting on the internet, Kanae Kijima began to realize that her skills in manipulation and deception could bring her not only moral satisfaction, but also financial gain. In 2007, she began actively using dating sites to meet lonely men of middle and old age who were looking for stable relationships. These men were often financially secure, making them ideal targets for Kanae. She always presented herself as a caring, kind-hearted woman ready to create a cozy home. Kanae used her knowledge of psychology to quickly gain the trust of her victims. She listened attentively to their problems, offered advice, and seemed like the perfect partner who understood and supported them. After some time, Kanae would start asking for money for various needs: medical bills, debts, sudden accidents. There was always a plausible excuse. She promised to repay the money as soon as she could, but this never happened. In most cases, the men willingly gave her large sums, believing in the seriousness of her intentions. However, this wasn't enough for Kanae. She wanted more, and soon she began planning her crimes with particular cruelty. She built trusting relationships with men to such an extent that they began to see her as part of their lives. Then Kanae would take the next step, proposing to live together or get married, which of course meant even more financial outlays on the part of her victims. Once she got everything she wanted, her attention shifted to the next step, eliminating the victim. Kanae understood that if her actions went unnoticed, she could continue her activities without fear of being caught. She began meticulously planning the murders of her victims, creating situations where their deaths would appear as accidents or suicides. The first known crime linked to Kanae Kijima occurred in 2009. She met a man named Kiyoshi Aoyama, who was captivated by her warmth and care. They quickly grew close, and Kanae moved in with him. Soon after, she convinced him to take out several loans to help her with financial problems. When Aoyama had fulfilled all her requests, Kanae began planning his murder. A few weeks after they met, he was found dead in his home. Initially, doctors assumed his death was due to natural causes, but later, a detailed investigation revealed that Aoyama had been poisoned. This crime marked the beginning of a series of murders that Kanae Kijima committed over the years. Her methods became increasingly sophisticated, and her victims were men who never suspected that their lives were in mortal danger. After killing Kiyoshi Aoyama, Kanae Kijima realized that her strategy was successful. Confidence in her impunity pushed her toward further crimes. Her subsequent actions became even more calculated, and her methods of killing more sophisticated. In 2009, Kanae met Takayo Owaiwa, an elderly man who owned a successful small business. They met through one of the many dating sites, and the relationship developed according to a familiar pattern for Kanae. She quickly gained Oiwa's trust by presenting herself as a woman dreaming of a peaceful married life. Oiwa, charmed by her kindness and support, soon proposed marriage. Kanae used the situation to her advantage. Oiwa, like her previous victims, began giving her money for temporary difficulties. However, as soon as she got everything she wanted, her focus shifted to the next stage, eliminating Oiwa. He was soon found dead in his home, and the initial investigation did not arouse suspicion. Doctors assumed that he had died of natural causes, but it was later revealed that Oiwa had been murdered. This time, Kanae used carbon monoxide poisoning to create the illusion of an accident. She set up a generator in a closed space and left it running, leading to Oiwa's death. This method allowed her to avoid direct responsibility, as the death seemed accidental. After this crime, Kanae continued to seek out new victims. Her appetite grew, and she increasingly used the internet to find lonely men whom she could deceive and kill. A cold calculation appeared in her actions, and she focused more and more on developing plans that would ensure her financial gain and avoid punishment. One of her next victims was Koji Kondo, an elderly man who had recently lost his wife and was seeking comfort in new relationships. Kanae quickly entered his life, using her tried and tested methods once again. She suggested living together, and Kondo agreed, unaware of the danger that awaited him. A few weeks after they started living together, he was found dead in his apartment. This time, Kanae used sleeping pills mixed with alcohol to kill Kondo. The death appeared to be an accident or suicide, allowing Kanae to once again avoid suspicion. Each new crime made Kanae more confident in her abilities. She saw herself as untouchable and her victims as mere tools for achieving her goals. However, her growing audacity and ruthlessness gradually attracted the attention of law enforcement, who began to notice similarities in these seemingly unrelated deaths. Meanwhile, Kanae continued to live her life, finding new victims and devising increasingly cunning plans. She became a master at manipulating people to get what she wanted without considering the moral consequences of her actions. With each new crime, Kanae Kijima became increasingly entangled in her web of lies and deceit. She knew that the success of her plan depended on her ability to create believable stories for those around her. She used her manipulation skills to convince friends and acquaintances of her innocence, avoiding any suspicion. Kanae carefully concealed her true intentions, creating the image of a caring and respectable woman. She skillfully used social media and messaging apps to maintain contact with multiple potential victims simultaneously. Her behavior became even more sophisticated. She built relationships with several men at the same time, exploiting their weaknesses and vulnerabilities for her own ends. One of her next victims was Nobutaro Kawasaki, an elderly man who, like the others before him, sought new love after losing his wife. Kanae skillfully convinced him that their relationship should be based on trust and mutual support. Unaware of Kanae's sinister intentions, Kawasaki began transferring significant sums of money to her. She fed him fabricated stories about her financial difficulties and urgent expenses. Kawasaki trusted her and believed he was helping his future wife. However, after Kanae had received everything she wanted, she saw no reason to continue the relationship. As with her previous victims, she decided to get rid of Kawasaki to avoid the exposure of her schemes. This time, she used a method she had successfully tested before. Kanae drugged Kawasaki with sleeping pills and then used carbon monoxide gas to stage his death as an accident. Her mastery in covering her tracks and manipulating people reached a new level. However, Kanae began making mistakes. Inconsistencies and suspicious moments started appearing in her life, which some of her acquaintances noticed. Her attempts to conceal the traces of her crimes became increasingly risky. Some people began to wonder why so many deaths were occurring around Kanae. These suspicions were the first signals to the police that something was amiss. Law enforcement agencies began to closely examine all the deaths connected to Kanae. Although there was no clear evidence of her guilt yet, investigators began piecing together the disjointed fragments of her dark life. Despite the growing pressure, Kanae Kijima continued her dangerous game. Her confidence in her own invulnerability grew with each new crime, but with that confidence came carelessness. She started making mistakes that ultimately led to her downfall. The investigators working on Kijima's case began noticing similar elements in all the deaths of her alleged victims. Mysterious circumstances, suspicious coincidences, and strange details that didn't align with typical cases of death. These observations pushed the police to conduct a more thorough investigation into Kanae's life. Medical examiners working on the cases of her victims began finding traces of sleeping pills and other substances in the bodies of the deceased. These discoveries became the first real evidence that the deaths were not accidental but carefully planned murders. However, gathering enough evidence to charge Kanae was still a daunting task. Meanwhile, Kanae remained unaware that investigators were closing in on her. She continued her everyday life, finding new victims and continuing her schemes. However, her actions began attracting the attention of not only the police, but also journalists who started reporting on the strange coincidences in her life. One of the turning points was Kanae's acquaintance with Hajime Kataoka, another lonely man who fell for her tricks. However, this time she didn't account for the fact that Kataoka had extensive connections within the local police. When Kataoka began to suspect that something was off with Kanae, he shared his concerns with a friend who was an investigator. These suspicions became the final link in the chain of evidence that the police were compiling against Kanae. Soon, investigators began surveilling her, recording her actions and contacts with new victims. Kanae was still unaware that her life filled with lies and deceit was drawing to a close. The investigators began gathering testimonies and statements from people who had interacted with Kanae. Gradually, the picture of her crimes became increasingly clear. Kanae continued to search for new victims, but the police were already one step ahead. The investigation reached a critical point, and the police began more actively monitoring Kanae Kijima. Surveillance was conducted around the clock. Her phone calls were tapped, and her social media accounts were closely monitored. Every move Kanae made was now being recorded to gather enough evidence for her arrest. Kanae still had no idea she was under surveillance. She continued to meet potential victims, hoping to extract money from them before staging another accident. However, her confidence began to waver slightly. She felt something had changed, but she couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. Meanwhile, investigators began uncovering key pieces of evidence that confirmed her guilt. Bank statements showing large transfers from victims to her account became a crucial link in the chain of accusations. Police also discovered that Kanae frequently purchased sleeping pills from various pharmacies, disguising herself as different people. One of the most significant breakthroughs in the investigation occurred when the police gained access to Kanae's correspondence with one of her victims. In these messages, she described her future plans, which included marriage and a life together, thereby giving false hopes to the man. These messages demonstrated the level of her manipulation and confirmed her intention to exploit people for her own gain. Surveillance also revealed that Kanae continued to communicate with several men simultaneously, promising each of them something important and meaningful. She played on their emotions and fears, making them do things they would never normally do. Investigators realized that Kanae was preparing for another crime, and they needed to act quickly to prevent it. Despite the mounting evidence, the police knew that Kanae's arrest had to be flawless to eliminate any possibility of error. It was decided to act preemptively, arresting her at the moment when she was about to meet her next victim. This step was risky, but the investigators knew they had enough material to charge her. Kanae arranged a meeting with her next victim at a cozy restaurant where she planned to carry out the next phase of her scheme. The investigators were already prepared, waiting for the right moment to arrest her. The entire operation was planned to minimize risk and catch her off guard. On the day Kanae entered the restaurant, she still had no idea she was being watched. She greeted her victim with her usual smile, but she didn't have time to take another step before the police entered the restaurant. Everything happened so quickly that Kanae didn't even have time to realize that her game was over. The police arrested Kanae Kijima right in the restaurant, in front of her next victim. Her attempts to justify herself and convince those around her of her innocence were futile. The investigators led her out of the restaurant, and the operation they had been preparing for so long was finally completed. Kanae Kijima's arrest caused a major public outcry. All of Japan followed her case with interest, which had already become one of the most high-profile in the country's history. The media covered every step of the investigation, and the trial of Kanae became a central event in the news. The process of preparing for the trial was meticulously organized. The prosecution gathered a vast amount of evidence to convince the court of Kanae's guilt. Materials were presented proving her involvement in several murders and attempts at fraud. It was important to demonstrate that all these crimes were carefully planned and committed with the intention of obtaining financial gain. Kanae's lawyers tried to create the image of their client as a victim of circumstances, claiming that her actions were dictated by emotional instability and psychological problems. They attempted to present her behavior as the result of a difficult childhood and complex life situations that allegedly pushed her to commit crimes. The first court session began with the reading of the charges. The prosecutor detailed each crime connected to Kanae, backing his words with evidence and witness testimonies. One by one, victims and witnesses took the stand, describing how they were deceived and how Kanae manipulated them to get what she wanted. Experts in criminology and psychiatry also presented their findings on Kanae's psychological state. They noted her ability to manipulate and lack of remorse, which indicated that she was fully aware of the consequences of her actions and deliberately committed the crimes. The trial was long and tense. Kanae remained calm, rarely showing emotions, which only heightened interest in her personality. She continued to claim that she was not guilty and that she had been misunderstood. However, the evidence against her was too convincing. As the trial continued, the public increasingly discussed the story. On social media and forums, people shared their opinions about Kanae. Some tried to understand her motives, while others categorically condemned her actions. Some even began to doubt that she could have committed such terrible crimes, but the evidence spoke for itself. The trial was drawing to its logical conclusion. The prosecution presented all its evidence, and now it was the defense's turn to try to challenge the charges. But many understood that Kanae's chances of acquittal were slim. The judicial proceedings entered their climax, and now the focus was on assessing the presented evidence. Each testimony, each piece of evidence was carefully analyzed to exclude the possibility of error. The judges and jurors closely followed the process, understanding the importance of every decision. Defense lawyers tried to dispute the accusations, arguing that the evidence presented against Kanae was circumstantial. They insisted that some deaths could have been accidental and that some witness testimonies might have been distorted under pressure from the investigation. However, the prosecutors were well prepared and confidently countered all attempts by the defense to cast doubt on Kanae's guilt. One of the key moments of the trial was the presentation of the results of forensic medical examinations. Experts confirmed that many of the deceased men had indeed been poisoned with sleeping pills that Kanae had purchased at different pharmacies. This information was supported by pharmacy receipts and testimonies from pharmacists who confirmed that Kanae had bought these drugs. Relatives and friends of the deceased also testified in court. Their stories about how Kanae gained the trust of their loved ones, then manipulated them, and ultimately led them to their deaths, shocked those present. These testimonies reinforced the understanding of how cunning and calculating Kanae was. However, the defense tried to use these emotionally charged moments to their advantage, arguing that the testimonies might have been exaggerated due to grief and the desire to find someone to blame. The lawyers claimed that many of the men could have decided to commit suicide because of their personal problems, and Kanae just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nevertheless, the prosecutors kept returning to the facts. The coincidences in the manner of death, the financial gains Kanae received after the deaths of her suitors, and her numerous false identities. These facts spoke for themselves and gradually formed a coherent picture of premeditated murders committed to gain financial profit. During the judicial proceedings, it also became known about several other episodes that suggested Kanae Kijima had been engaged in fraud and manipulation long before the first murders. These revelations strengthened the prosecution's case and made Kanae's situation nearly hopeless. The judge and jury carefully listened to both sides, understanding that their decision would have far-reaching consequences. A person's life was at stake, but so was justice for the victims and their families. Both sides prepared for the final stage of the trial, the closing arguments and the delivery of the verdict. After Kanae Kijima's arrest, the investigation began to uncover all the details of her crimes. But despite the collected evidence, Kijima stubbornly denied her guilt. Her lawyers built their defense on the argument that Kijima was not directly involved in the men's deaths and that all of them could have died of natural causes. This argument seemed absurd, but it slowed down the case. The investigators had to gather enough evidence to convince the court of Kanae Kijima's guilt. They conducted meticulous work, examining financial records, social media messages, emails, and even the personal diaries of the victims. It turned out that many of the men she had deceived were experiencing serious financial difficulties due to their relationships with Kijima. However, finding direct evidence of murder was challenging. One of the key moments in the investigation was the discovery of traces of sleeping pills in the victims' bodies by forensic pathologists. This provided grounds to believe that Kijima might have used these substances to sedate her victims before staging their suicides. Additionally, traces of arson were found at several crime scenes, which were believed to have been used to cover up evidence. The trial of Kanae Kijima became one of the most talked about events in Japan. The public was shocked by how a woman could so cold-bloodedly manipulate people and deprive them of their lives for money. In court, she continued to assert her innocence, which only heightened the tension. The process against Kanae Kijima lasted several months. Prosecutors presented all the collected evidence, including financial fraud, traces of sleeping pills, and witness testimonies confirming that Kijima deceived her victims, promising them love and support, but in reality, she was only after profit. The defense, on the other hand, tried to present her actions as the result of unfortunate coincidences, but public opinion and the judges were against her. In the end, the court delivered its verdict. Kanae Kijima was found guilty of murdering 3 men and committing fraud for financial gain. She was sentenced to death, which became one of the harshest punishments in modern Japan. This verdict sent a strong message to society that even the most sophisticated crimes will eventually be uncovered, and the guilty will be brought to justice. Kanae Kajima's story left a deep mark on Japanese society. Her case became a symbol of warning for those who seek easy profit at the expense of others. It also showed that modern technology and social media can become dangerous tools in the hands of criminals. This woman's story also served as a reminder that people can be easily deceived if their most vulnerable feelings, love and trust, are exploited. Kanae Kijima remained in the memory of many as one of Japan's most ruthless criminals. Her actions caused a huge public outcry, and even after her execution, society continued to discuss the causes and consequences of her crimes. This case made many ponder the nature of evil and how far a person can go after losing their moral compass.